Okay, so today what we're going to try to do is create a preset that's covering kind of some of those really stereotypical 80s studio guitarist kind of tones. And this is completely inspired by a video that Ronquillo did recently around creating an ultimate 80s rack pedal board. And if you're not familiar with RJ's channel, I'll link to the video I'm talking about here and also put the link in the description. If you're not familiar with his channel, I would encourage you to check it out and subscribe to it. It's a great channel. But what he was doing was creating a pedal board version of that kind of 80s studio, rack mount rig. So think Steve Lukather, Dan Huff, those kind of guys. So what I wanted to do today was try to do the same kind of thing, but on the Quad Cortex. So we think about that kind of rig, and what he was working off was this diagram of Lukather's rig in the mid-80s. And apologies here for the fuzziness, the images in high res. Basically what's going on here is you have the guitar into really the preamp section of a head, or in this case, the head into a load box. And then from there, you're running it through the rack effects. So starting with a compressor into an EQ, and then into a tri-stereo chorus. And then you've got a mixer that's mixing in some harmonization and a digital reverb. And then out of that, you go through digital delay into the power amps and the speaker cabinets. And so we're going to create a similar thing on the Quad Cortex. I think the Quad Cortex is pretty well set up to recreate a good chunk of this. There's not really a tri-stereo chorus, but we've got our dual chorus. I think that'll get us close enough. And we won't use a mixer to mix in these effects. We'll just use the mix controls on the effects themselves. So let's run over to the preset. What I did here from an amp perspective, I actually went back to some of the initial presets that I first created on the Quad Cortex that were based around some captures. And specifically what I was doing at the time was, for my gain sounds, a lot of my sounds in my analog rig were coming from a Victory Jack preamp pedal. And then I was running that through the power amp section of my amp head. And so I was doing the same thing on the Quad Cortex. And that kind of led me down using that path. So what I've got here is for the clean tones, the base of the clean tone is this, which is a Kingsley Maiden capture that I found in the Cortex Cloud. So if you're not familiar with Kingsley pedals, these are great tube-driven pedals. I think the guys up in Canada, it's one of those things where it's boutique, long wait list, but they're really great. If you watch that pedal show with Dan and Mick, you've probably seen these pedals. So the Kingsley Maiden is basically a Fender Blackface preamp. And this one is bright, and it's a little too bright for my taste. And so what I did is I put another Kingsley pedal capture in front of it. This is the Kingsley Page. And this is basically it's not a preamp, but it's a pedal that kind of colors the tone to be kind of dumble-ish. And I did this because I wanted to kind of warm up the tone a little bit going into the Maiden. And then for the driven tones, what we'll do is we're going to use this Jack preamp capture that I did of my Victory Jack preamp. And we're using that for the driven sounds. And then all these preamps in the end are running through these power amp captures that are built into the Quad Cortex of a EL34. You can see we're running stereo here, and we'll get into that in a second. And then coming out of that, for the clean tones, we're running the 4x12 high watt cabinet. And for the driven tones, we're using this 4x12 Mesa cabinet with V30s in it. So let's hear what the sounds are like without any of the effects. And so here's the clean tone. From there, we're going to build out our preset. So again, if we think about the Lukather diagram we were looking at before, the first step was to go through a compressor. What he was using at the time was a VCA type compressor, and that's what I've got here on the Quad Cortex. So if we turn that on, you can see here, not a lot of compression. I've got the threshold set so that you really have to kind of dig into it to get a good amount of gain reduction down here. And it's also boosting the signal a little bit. And then from there, we're going into our EQ. And I'm using a Graphic 9 EQ. And really what we're doing here is we're bringing down some of the lows, pushing some of the mids and upper mids, And this is just helping the tone kind of cut a little bit more through all the effects. We're still pretty dry, but now we've compressed the tone and we've EQ'd it a little bit, and we're kind of getting into that 80s clean tone a little bit. From there, we go through the chorus. And on the Lukather setup, we were using a tri-stereo chorus. We don't have that on the Quad Cortex. And so I've got a couple choruses here. One is we're using a Chief DC 2W, and obviously we're running this in stereo, and we're using it in mode 4. Or we're using the dual chorus here, and we've got the rate set moderate and the depth only at 40%. So again, we're just adding in some of that kind of stereo chorus effect. So I think the dual chorus is more like that tri-stereo chorus. The Chief chorus, this is actually the specific chorus model that Dan Huff used to use. And so I've got both in here, and I'm actually using the Chief chorus more on some of the driven sounds because it's not as swirly as the dual chorus. So from there, what we're doing is now we're breaking into the stereo signal. So these are stereo effects. And what I'm doing here is we're splitting off into two paths. And you can see here, we're running a split stereo. So that means we're splitting left and right down the two different paths. And then we mix them back together. We're panning left and right. So we're maintaining that left and right stereo spread of all the effects. And then in each path, what we're doing is we've got a pitch shift that's doing a fine pitch shift of 9 cents. And one is doing -9, one is doing +9. So again, that's giving a chorus kind of effect. And then we're going into a hall reverb on each channel. And then we're using a digital delay. And the reason I've got these set up in the mono left-right lines is because we need to run them through the power amp, and the power amp capture is not a stereo effect. So we need to be running parallel paths to get the full stereo effect from the choruses and whatnot. So with everything on, so that's just with the pitch shifts. Let me bring up the gig view here. And then I've got one scene that's using the Chief chorus. And then there's another scene that's what I'm calling swirly chorus, which is with the dual chorus. So you've got that really swirly, affected, kind of 80s compressed clean tone. I think it's working pretty well. So let's switch to the crunchier tones. Again, this is engaging the jack preamp. And right now, I've still got the pitch shift on and the reverb and delay. So there's still kind of a chorusy tone to it. And I'm only using the jack preamp capture that's on level 3, so not tons of gain. We can add a chorus to that. The other thing we can do is we can boost that with that same Kingsley Page kind of Dumble boost. And then lastly, I wanted to create kind of a lead kind of tone, so a little bit more gain, a little bit more fullness. And what I ended up doing was pulling in a tube screamer overdrive. So usually for this kind of thing, I would pull in more of a clon type of pedal. But since clons were developed kind of in the early 90s, I didn't think like it would be appropriate to do a kind of a mid-80s tone preset and use a clon type pedal. So instead I pulled in a tube screamer. And so if you kick the front of both the Page into the jack with the tube screamer, you get this. And then we can add in that chorus if we want. So kind of a fun preset, and I think we got pretty close to, that kind of 80s rack tone sounds that RJ was doing in his video. As always, I'll put this preset up on my Cortex Cloud account so you can grab it and download it and play with it. And let me know what you think in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching.